Good morning and welcome to an ACT Chess Association summary of our online events which are held at chess.com while the coronavirus restrictions are slowly being lifted across Canberra. In fact, the Wednesday night rapid tournament, which this game that I'm about to show you came from, is our only online event that we're now running, and we're probably just going to run it through to the end of the year. Before we finish it up, as just about all chess activity is restarting face-to-face here in Canberra, including coming up this weekend, the Vikings Weekender down at the Lanyon Club down in Tuggeranong, and that's already looking like a strong field, 60 players, we've hit our limit. There are 2 Grandmasters and 1 IM playing in the top section. But I might do a summary of that next week at some point, but for now I'm doing the online event, which occurred last night. It was won by Tim Pearce with an impressive 3 wins from 3 games. It was only a small event, 6 players, 3 round Swiss. But the game I'm featuring is a game between Glenn Ingham and Matthew Bennett. And Matt Bennett lost to Tim Pearce in the first round by overreaching, but went on to win his next 2 games to finish on 2 out of 3. And I'm going to feature this game in part because it's about how you can refute gambits by just playing sensible moves. But I'm just going to ask, if you're watching this as a replay or even watching this as a live stream, just hang around to the end because there's a bit of a surprise waiting at the end, and it's well worth staying for that. So, the time limit was 10 minutes plus 2 seconds per move. Glenn Ingham is white, Matthew Bennett is black, and it starts off e4, e6. Matthew Bennett's played the French most of his life, so it's not entirely unfamiliar territory for both himself and his opponent, because as you might know, when you play club players who play the same openings over and over again, it does give you an opportunity to prepare what you're going to play. So it's an advanced French after Queen b6, and normal moves here are either a3, and the other option is Bishop e2. But in this case, Glenn goes for the exciting Milner-Barry gambit with Bishop d3. And after pawn takes here, the one trap you really want to pay attention to for starters, if you're not really familiar with this position, is you just can't grab the pawn here. Because after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop b5 attacks the king with the bishop, and the black queen is hanging to the queen on d1. So that's, on the one hand, you might say it's a cheap trap, but basically bishop d3 is still a good move in this position. So black normally plays bishop d7 here so that there's no check on b5. So you are now simply threatening to take the pawn. And the Milner-Barry proper, of course, you castle and you give up the d pawn here. Now, just a little excursion into some different opening lines. I'm quite partial to knight g5 here, the Sorosin gambit, but I am giving it a dubious mark because it actually is quite unsound. Black can just do well sensibly by retreating the knight back to c6 and has a small advantage, pawn up plus the e-pawn's under pressure. What white is really hoping for is something like reflexively like h6, and there are a number of good lines. Queen h5 can be played here, but I'll just show you the knight takes f7 line. King takes f7, queen h5 check, king goes to e7, and then bishop e3 with the threat of retreating the queen to h4, check, and picking up the knight on d4 due to the double attack from the queen and the bishop. Weirdly enough, if the king goes back to d8, which is the best move here, in a line that only a computer could love, it says that queen g4 here, kind of forcing h5 followed by queen h4 check, is the right way to play this. After bishop e7, then we take on d4, and we take and we take. Because the line that looks obvious is just to simply check straight away after king d8. And after g5, queen takes d4, queen takes, bishop takes, knight e7. And you might wonder what the difference between this position here and this position here is. But I think, according to the computer analysis, this is slightly better for black because the e-pawn is a target, and the bishop on f8 can go to g7 because g5 has been played, and the knight on e7 can go to g6 and gang up on the pawn, as opposed to in this position, the bishop's on e7 blocking the knight, and the g7 pawn hasn't moved, so the bishop doesn't have an opportunity to go to g7. But as I said, this is a line that only computers could love. Normally, you know, don't play h6 if you're playing this position, or if you're playing me, do play h6. But otherwise, knight c6 is the normal, safe, and sensible reply in this case. White played knight c3 here. Knight b d2 is better in this line, and the argument here is a very short version: is knight takes f3, knight takes f3. So there's still a knight on f3 in this capture, and after something like bishop c5, rook b1, and white still has the option of playing knight to g5 followed by queen to h5 and putting pressure on the king side. Instead, after knight takes c3, knight takes f3, knight c3, knight takes f3, queen takes f3. The knight on c3 is going to find it a lot harder to get across to the king side. And after knight e7, black is starting to get on top here. White had sacrificed a pawn for development, but every exchange of pieces only allows black to catch up and or get closer to an ending where that extra pawn will count for something. Queen g3 is not a bad idea, protecting the e-pawn. Rook b1 to cover b2 and allow the dark square bishop to move was clearly white's idea here. But knight g6, taking into account the fact that white isn't protecting the e-pawn for the moment, is good, but it mattered not, because after bishop g5, knight went to g6 anyway. I don't think white is really keen on swapping this knight off, because after this there's an open h-file. Sure, the black king can't castle, but white's running out of pieces to prosecute this attack because they're all getting swapped. And open h-file might in fact end up working in black's favour. So the queen went to e2. Okay. a6, obviously trying to stop things from getting into b5, but I'm not sure that was necessary. And king went to h1 to get off the diagonal. White still has a plan here of just playing f4 and possibly f5 to try and open up the king while the king's still trapped in the center, and that's not a bad idea to follow that. But black could have probably just now put white under an enormous amount of pressure with d4. After knight d1, queen goes to a5, and there's the issue of what to do about the a-pawn and the e-pawn, which are both under attack from the queen and attacked by the knight as well. And if you go somewhere like knight e4, of course, you're cutting off the defense of the e-pawn from the queen on e2. h6, let's just kick the bishop for a bit, and then knight takes e5, and that's suddenly 2 pawns to the good, and white, while still having a lead in development, isn't finding enough compensation here, I think. So bishop e7, a little bit passive, especially because as much as you're up a pawn and you want to swap pieces off, you've also always got to ask yourself what's going to be left on the board in this position. And I think the white squared bishop on d3 is, at least for now, superior to the black bishop on d7. And so white goes f4 and aims to try and start opening up the position with a move like f5. It's not quite going to work. There's too many pieces defending for the moment, but it's something to plan for. Black played g6, which on the one hand is an understandable move because it wants to stop the pawn from getting to f5 in certain lines. But in the end, I don't like it. It creates a big hole on f6, and the knight on c3, I've just drawn this arrow here for the knight to f6. Now, the knight isn't going to move there directly, but the knight has got a number of paths to get there via d1, f2, g4, f6 in some lines. And the other issue, of course, is simply that without a dark squared bishop, because that's got swapped off, the dark squares around the king, if the king goes to this side of the board, are going to be terribly weak. So the knight went to d1, okay, starting that journey. Knight across to c6, knight f2, and knight b4. So black's strategy looks like at the moment just swapping things off, and that's a bit double-edged. If your opponent doesn't have any tricks or counterplay, sure, it simplifies and it's good. But if you're taking your time, for example, that knight's taken 2 moves and 1 more move to swap off the bishop, which hasn't been moving. So white essentially is getting some free moves in this position. White played rook fd1 just to back up the bishop there, but knight g4, funnily enough, does work in this position, and it's worth keeping an eye on this idea, because after knight takes d3, throw in knight f6 to force the king to move, so keep it trapped in the center. king d8, and then you can play queen takes d3, and I suspect white probably did see this line or a line that looked a lot like this and didn't like bishop g5 because it's skewering the queen and the rook. But if you play queen b3, in a sense the bishop's currently pinned because nothing's protecting the queen. And so when you do protect the queen or move the queen, then the rook on f1 has time to skedaddle out of trouble. Instead, the rook went straight away, and that just gave black time to take. Knight takes d3, and again, as I keep saying, as more and more pieces come off, black's position is getting better and better. Not because of the placement of pieces as much as black is getting closer to the ending where they're a good pawn up. And bishop g5, pin and win, we're still going for this strategy here. Queen to f3, again, you could probably take here on d3 if you wanted to. But black probably started to drift a little bit here. Rook c2 is another idea, just taking control of the 7th rank. But black castled, and I think the idea here is looking at the moves like rook c2 followed by the rook on f8 coming across to control the c file. White could have played rook d2 now just to try and stop that rook from getting in, but went knight f2 because the plan of rerouting the knight to here is back on the table. Rook went to c2, knight went to g4, and bishop went to e2. By the way, if you're in a position like this where it's clear that you're starting to go down and your opponent is slowly swapping stuff off, it's almost imperative to try something. And in this case, starting to throw the pieces at the king is one of the better swindling strategies that we find in a game of chess where people are under pressure and are down material. So knight f6, check, king g7, and queen h3. White is threatening mate here, so I'm not going to, that's always a good threat to be able to pull off in this position. And rook h8 coming across to defend the pawns one way. h5, but h5 runs the risk of running into a move like g4. And we're going to see that in a second. So rook h8, and then the rook goes to safety here. Rook takes b2, yeah, why not? Winning another pawn. And rook goes to c1 instead of swapping. Because, yeah, you want to keep as many pieces on the board. And the rook on c1 becomes terribly important in literally 2 moves. And I'm not sure what black was doing. I think black may have been seduced by the fact that they just wanted to keep swapping stuff off. But d4 is the right move here. You just play d4, and the idea is you're going to play d3, d2, and fork those rooks. And it's kind of hard, really hard to defend against that threat. And there's just a clear advantage for black in this position. But after rook bait, black played h5, and this just encouraged white to play g4 as the last desperate throw of the dice. And then black made a massive blunder. Black took on g4 here. And it looks plausible. The queen's under attack. And where do you put the queen? The queen can go to g3 maybe, but yeah, I mean, it's not so great. But after the queen goes to g3, bishop f3 check just wins the queen essentially, because the only way to get out of check is to sack the queen. But white has this fantastic response after h takes g4. Queen takes h8. Double exclamation mark. Okay. King takes h8, and that rook on c1 suddenly hits c8. King's in check. King goes to g7, and then rook goes to g8. King only has one square, and that's h6. And if white wants an immediate draw in this position, rook h8, king g7, rook g8. And that's it. And the king has to go to h6, and the rook shuffles back, and it's a draw. If white wanted to be a little bit more clever, even rook h7 here. King to f8, and then you fork king and queen. Okay. And after king e7, for example, you take on b6. Black has to throw in the intermediate move of bishop check to save the bishop on e2. King here, and after rook takes b6, this position is equal. But just as black made a massive blunder with h takes g4, white made an even bigger blunder in this position. Instead of looking at queen takes g8, and white had about 55 seconds on the clock, black had about 3 minutes on the clock. White resigned. White decided there was no point in playing on in this position and resigned the game. Missing queen takes h8 saving half a point. Now, Grandmaster Ian Rogers is currently writing a book on games where people have resigned instead of saving the game. Resigns being the worst move in the position when there's substantially better moves in the position. And this would be a perfect game for that book. So I'm going to throw that across to him. Sorry, guys, Glenn and Matt Bennett, because I'm sure it's going to hopefully turn up in the book, and you guys might get famous out of it. However, let's just come back to this position here. What should black have done instead? Black should have started with bishop takes f3. Because after queen takes f3 here, it's black who gets the brilliancy. Black plays rook takes h2, king takes h2, h takes g4, and the discovered check wins the queen. King goes to g3, you take on f3, and black is just winning in this position. So there we go. A spectacular finish. Well played game by black all the way up until this move. But did the right things with the gambit, took the gambit, kept swapping pieces off as necessary. Maybe a few of the decisions to swap pieces off may not have been the best. And was cruising to victory until h takes g4. But it paid off because white decided there was nothing more to play for here and resigned when, as I keep saying to all the juniors I coach, look at all checks and all captures. And white just had to look at queen takes h8 check and then followed up with rook check, and there would have been half a point saved. So that was a game from last night's ACT Rapid Play online event, which is on Wednesday nights from 7 p.m. Between, in this case, Glenn Ingham and Matthew Bennett, and it was a win for Matthew Bennett, but as you see, might not have been. My name's Sean Press. I do these summaries on Twitch, normally on Thursdays after the tournament has been completed. I then transfer them across to YouTube if you want to watch them on replay as well. And as I said, we run these events for the benefit of ACT players and local players, and then hopefully we'll be able to run them all the way through to the end of the year. 2021, different year. We're probably back to over the board chess, but keep your eye on my Twitch stream, and we'll see what's happening. So thanks very much for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you next week.